Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, today we're going all the way back to ancient China.
Ooh,
Yeah, we're talking
I
Confucius,
love this.
and we're looking at excerpts from an incredible text that dives deep into the
Ah,
analects. Now, you know how today we're kind of obsessed with social security numbers?
right.
Well, back then, names were like their own little social security numbers. They told you everything you needed to know about someone's status, their family, their whole identity.
It's so true.
Like, get this, Confucius didn't even go by Confucius.
What?
And a woman's name could actually change based on her husband's achievements,
Wow.
even after he was gone. Like, how crazy is that?
That's wild. I mean, it really is fascinating because in ancient China, names were more than just these simple identifiers.
Mm.
They were like these intricate codes that revealed a person's place in the social hierarchy, their ancestry, even their accomplishments. It's incredible.
Okay, I'm already hooked. So let's break this code down. First up, we've got the given name and the courtesy name. It seems like everybody had both back then,
Everyone did.
which is pretty different from today.
Right. So think of it this way. You've got the given name, which is what you get at birth. That's the name your family uses, your elders use it. And then at a certain age, you'd receive this courtesy name. So for men, they got theirs at 20 during this coming of age ceremony.
Okay.
It marked their transition into adulthood. And for women, it was linked to their engagement at 15, marking their entry into a new social role.
So it's like a nickname, but way more meaningful.
Yeah, exactly. And using that courtesy name was a big sign of respect. Even Confucius in the Analects, he uses his given name, Ku, when he's referring to himself, which actually adds this whole other layer of complexity to how we understand social interactions and etiquette back then.
That's so interesting. I'm starting to see how names were less about like personal identity and more about reflecting social roles and relationships.
You got it. And then you add in the meanings woven into these names, it gets even deeper. For example, Confucius had a student named Zhang Yu. His courtesy name was Zilu, and both of those names mean road. Other students had courtesy names with the opposite meanings of their given names, or names that complemented each other. It's this interplay of language and symbolism. It's remarkable.
It's like they were creating these intricate verbal puzzles, each name a piece of this larger cultural tapestry.
A perfect way to put it. So now let's move on to surnames, which, as you'll see, are pretty different from how we think of them today.
Okay, perfect timing, because I wanted to bring up that story from our source material about the rickshaw driver. In Quafu, Confucius's hometown, he claimed that Confucius's surname was actually Liang.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah?
That anecdote just highlights a really common misconception. The concept of surname, back then the characters, it referred to a large political group. And these surnames were actually bestowed by the king of Zhou himself. And there weren't that many of them. Only about 21 during the spring and autumn period, which, was a time of huge political fragmentation and constant warfare between these different states in China. Confucius's actual surname was Zi, a lineage that connected him to the Shang dynasty, which came even before the Zi dynasty.
So when we say surname today, we think about family names, passed down through generations. But back then, it was more about belonging to this massive political group.
Exactly. It was a marker of your allegiance and your place in this whole power structure. So,
Okay, so if surname was all about political identity, how do we make sense of all these other names we see? Like Confucius.
you're on the right track. That's where clan names come in, represented by the character.
Interesting. Are we talking like extended family groups here?
Yeah.
Like clans in other cultures?
It actually started with something quite different. Clan names were originally derived from fiefs, pieces of land granted to nobles by the king. So if a noble received land called Lu, he would also be known as belonging to the Lu clan. But over time, this idea expanded to represent anything a man could boast about: official positions, places of residence, even their ancestors' distinguished courtesy names.
So the more successful a guy was, the more clan names he racked up.
You got it. It was like collecting trophies, a way for men to really showcase their status and achievements.
But I bet that got confusing fast,
You bet it did.
especially trying to follow historical records.
Zuo Zuan, which is a chronicle of that period. And it's really hard to read because some individuals are referred to by multiple clan names.
Just like trying to keep track of a character in a book
Yeah.
who keeps changing aliases.
Exactly. Okay, so along with all these names and titles, there was this whole other thing governing social interactions, especially marriage.
Yeah,
Marrying within the same surname group was a huge no-no.
it was absolutely forbidden. So it wasn't just about like avoiding marrying your close relative, but anyone who shared that ancient political surname.
Yeah.
That seems seriously strict.
It was a big deal, and there were actually a lot of reasons for it. Women were considered valuable resources back then, and their marriages were essential for forging alliances and keeping the peace. Marrying outside your surname group was a way to reduce conflicts, build those strategic partnerships, and maximize the exchange of those valuable resources.
It's like this giant game of chess with marriages as strategic moves to maintain power and stability.
It really makes you think about how different their view of marriage was from ours today.
It definitely challenges our modern idea of marriage being about love and personal choice.
Now, this also busts a common myth,
Okay, what myth?
that the main reason for not marrying within the same surname group was to avoid kids with genetic problems. While that idea was around, it wasn't the main concern. In fact, even in later periods, like in the famous novel Dream of the Red Chamber, marriages between close maternal relatives were considered a good thing, not taboo.
So you could marry your cousin as long as they were on your mom's side.
Exactly.
That's so different from how we think of kinship today. Okay, but if men were using clan names to show off their accomplishments, how did they figure out who was eligible for marriage?
That's where the naming conventions for women come in.
Okay, tell me more.
While men were using their fancy clan names, women were generally addressed by their surnames. So right away, you knew if a woman belonged to your surname group, meaning she was off limits for marriage.
So a woman's surname was like a built-in compatibility checker?
Exactly.
It also shows how differently men and women were viewed in this whole system. But wait, I thought I read that a woman's name could change throughout her life.
You're right, her surname stayed the same. But the part before it could change based on her birth order, or even her husband's posthumous title, which is a title given after death. The example of Shen Jiang, who became Wu Jiang after her husband got the posthumous title Wu. Can you imagine your identity being tied to your husband's achievements?
Wow, even after he's gone. It really makes you think about the women whose names we don't know, their individual identities lost because they were tied to their fathers and husbands.
You're raising some important points there. So let's zoom out for a second and look at how this whole system of naming conventions evolves over time.
Okay, yeah, because with all those moving parts, the given names, the courtesy names, the surnames, the clan names, I'm curious to see how this lasted.
Well, like any social structure, it wasn't immune to change. And as we move into the later part of the spring and autumn period, we start to see some cracks appear in this seemingly rigid system.
Okay, so spill the tea. What caused those cracks?
Remember that rule about not marrying within the same surname group? It was designed to stop conflicts
Yeah.
and maintain alliances between these distinct political groups. But as the centuries went by, political boundaries shifted, and states with the same surnames suddenly needed to form alliances for strategic reasons.
So basically, practicality started to override tradition.
Exactly.
And I bet that led to some awkward situations, considering how important that rule was.
You're absolutely right. The example of Duke Zhao of Lu, who married a princess from the state of Wu. The problem was that both of their ruling families could trace their lineage back to the same ancient surname, the Ji surname. This was a blatant violation of the old rules, and it caused a major uproar. Even Confucius criticized him for it.
Can you imagine being called out by Confucius for breaking a social norm?
Right.
That's gotta hurt.
It shows the struggle between sticking to tradition and adapting to the changing world. Even though Duke Zhao's marriage was controversial, it showed that those age-old rules were starting to loosen up as the world changed around them.
So this unbreakable rule about marriage started bending under the weight of politics.
And that bending led to an even bigger transformation. By the time we get to the Warring States period, which was even more chaotic, the naming conventions became even more messed up. We even see this with Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China.
Yes, Qin Shi Huang. Everyone knows that name.
He was a major figure in Chinese history. But even figuring out how to address him properly is tricky. Was it Qin Zheng, using the state as his clan name? Or Ying Zheng, putting his surname before his given name? Some even called him Zhao Zheng, claiming he was related to a richer branch of the family. Even when he was alive, people weren't sure how to address him correctly.
Wow, so it's like the rules were being rewritten in the middle of the game.
Exactly.
Talk about an identity crisis, not just for individuals, but for the whole system. So what happened next? Did this naming free-for-all just keep going?
Luckily, some order was restored by the Western Han Dynasty, which came after all the chaos of the Warring States period. Surnames and clan names merged into what we now call surnames, which are mostly based on the clan names from back then.
So after all that complexity, those badges of honor became the defining part of a family name.
Exactly. It's amazing how this rigid system adapted and simplified over time.
I have a feeling this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore.
You're absolutely right. We've only scratched the surface. There's a lot more to discover about these naming conventions and how they impacted ancient Chinese society.
We talked about all these different naming conventions, but what about the name Confucius itself? It doesn't sound like any of the names we've talked about so far.
You've got a good point there. The using Confucius is actually a respectful title for men, kind of like how we might say master or mister today. And it's interesting because it wasn't really used as a title before Confucius's time.
So he was like a trendsetter, even in how he was addressed?
You could say that Confucius reached a high position in the Lu's government. He became the Grand Justice. And this high status probably led his students to use as a sign of respect when they talked to him.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
He was their teacher, their mentor, someone they looked up to. But did this title stick just because of his political job?
Well, his rank definitely played a role. But it's his influence as a scholar and teacher that really made the title permanent. Later generations focused less on his political achievements and more on his philosophical teachings. So the Z became less about his official rank and more about recognizing his wisdom and authority as a teacher.
It's like a badge of honor he earned through knowledge and influence, not just by climbing the political ladder. It makes you wonder if Confucius himself would have wanted to be remembered more for his teachings than for his time in politics.
It's an interesting thought experiment to think about how people want to be remembered compared to how history actually remembers them. And speaking of being remembered, this practice of using G as a respectful title wasn't just for Confucius. Other big thinkers like Munzi Mencius and Zhuangzi also got this distinction.
So it became a way to show respect for people who shaped intellectual and philosophical ideas. It's amazing how something as simple as a title can show how a society values different types of achievements.
Absolutely. It reminds us that names and titles aren't just for identification. They're about power status and how cultural values change over time.
And that evolution, as we've been talking about, involved both keeping things the same and changing things. We saw how those strict naming conventions had to adapt, especially that rule about not marrying someone with the same surname. What were some of the bigger consequences of that shift?
Well, one consequence was that it made those old political surnames less important. Remember, they were originally about separating different groups tied to the power structure. But as states with the same surnames had to team up, that separation became less important. And then the Warring States period, with all its conflict and changing power, just made this even more true.
It's like watching the foundation of their society start to crumble. Did this lead to any funny or awkward situations? I can't help but laugh thinking about Confucius criticizing a leader for a marriage alliance. It shows that even these famous figures were part of their time dealing with the drama of their day.
It also highlights the tension between tradition and change, which is something we see again and again throughout history. Even those rules and customs that seem untouchable have to be reinterpreted and adapted as things change.
It's a good reminder that culture isn't fixed. It's alive, and it's constantly being shaped by the people who live in it. Okay, so we've seen this naming system adapt, but did it ever completely break down? What happened after all this chaos?
Well, out of all that chaos, something interesting happened. Those two separate categories of surname and clan name merged together.
Wait, so they became one thing? How did that happen?
By the time of the Western Han Dynasty, what we call surname today came mostly from the many clan names of the past. It's like those badges of honor we talked about before became the main part of someone's family name.
So all that complicated history, all those layers of family and achievement were simplified into a single surname.
Exactly. And it reminds us that even aspects of culture that seem permanent can change. What was once a complicated system of surnames and clan names, separating groups and showing achievements, became the surname system we have today.
It's like finishing a chapter in a really complicated book. But those earlier chapters still matter and help us understand the whole story. But even though the system changed, I bet there are still traces of those old naming conventions around.
You're right. The echoes of those old surnames and clan names are still in many Chinese surnames today. They carry with them the legacy of family history and cultural identity. It shows that even as societies change, the past never really disappears.
And that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. We started by wanting to learn about ancient Chinese names, and we've ended up discovering a whole world of hidden meanings, social dynamics, and historical changes.
It shows how even the smallest details can help us understand a culture's journey through time.
Speaking of details, there's one more thing I'm curious about. We've learned how men and women were addressed differently. But what about children? Did they have special naming rules too?
That's an interesting detail. It shows how important family and ancestry were in ancient China.
Okay, you've got my attention. Tell me more.
It wasn't so much about special names. It was more about how children were addressed and how their names showed their connection to both their mother's and father's families.
So it's like those names were mini family trees, right? Can you give me an example?
Sure. Think about how people would mention the mother when talking about a child during the Qin and Han dynasties. For example, Emperor Jing of Han's sister was called the Princess of Du because her mother was Empress Dowager Du.
Wow, that shows how important the mother side of the family was in giving a child their identity. It wasn't just about the father's family. The mother's family mattered too.
Exactly. And this shows a different way of thinking about family and identity compared to many cultures today.
Yeah.
Imagine being introduced not just as your dad's son or daughter, but also as your mom's child, carrying both of those legacies with you.
It adds a whole other level of complexity, but also a sense of connection. You're not just an individual, you're part of this big web of family ties.
And that sense of belonging, of being rooted in a larger family network, was really important in ancient Chinese society. It wasn't just about bloodlines. It was about social obligations, shared history, and a feeling of connection across generations.
It makes you think about how that focus on family shaped their view of the world, their relationships, even their understanding of their place in the universe.
It's a fascinating question, and it's something that anthropologists and historians are still studying. It shows that even something as simple as a name can give us amazing insights into a culture's values, beliefs, and social structures.
I'm definitely having one of those aha moments right now. We started this deep dive wanting to learn about ancient Chinese names, and we've ended up uncovering a whole world of hidden meanings, social changes, and historical shifts.
It reminds us that names are never just labels. They're stories waiting to be told. They're windows into the past that can help us understand our present.
And those stories can be surprisingly complicated and interesting, even when they're about something as simple as what to call someone.
It shows the power of language and how even the tiniest details can reveal important truths about a culture.
This has been an amazing journey, and I have to say, I'm even more curious about ancient China now. Who knew that learning about names could be so eye-opening?
It reminds us that there's always more to learn, more to discover, and more connections to make. And that's what makes exploring so rewarding. So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listener with one final thought.
Okay, what's that?
As we've learned, names in ancient China were much more than just simple labels. They were complex codes that reflected social status, family ties, and cultural values. So as you go about your day, take a moment to think about the names you come across. Think about the stories they tell, the history they carry, and the connections they create.
You might be amazed by what you find.
That's a fantastic thought to end on.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.